Hello, everyone, and we will be starting in a couple minutes. This microphone right won't get that in. This one. Yeah, so that's just us. So that way you won't get that in. This one. That's just us.
Yeah, well, I actually have over 500 lectures that I did soon. They're all recorded, so it's kind of like working developing equity.
So that way you won't get that in. This one.
I would say about 200.
That's just us.
Yeah, well, I actually have over 500 lectures that I did soon. They're all recorded, so it's kind of like working developing. Well, I could connect my
So that way you won't get that in. This one.
the actual book that I want.
That's just us.
Yeah. I actually have over 500 lectures. I did not work without all these. They're all recorded, so kind of like the difference that well, I said I have the actual book that I want.
That's just us.
Yeah. I actually have over 500 lectures. I did not they're all recorded, so
Yeah, that's why. I'll get rid of it. I think the sound is coming from here. Here we go. This is where it's coming from. You're safe.
Oh, Allah. Okay.
right now we've got 29 people, 50 people registered. It's already 207. What do you think? Okay, so we should start. Why not? Why not?
All
All
right.
right, so I guess go ahead.
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. I praise Allah and I send peace and blessings upon the Prophet and Messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him. And before we start, I just want to thank St. Catherine's University and everyone who came together for this, and appreciate the invitation to come out. Again, my name is Dnr Abdulaziz. I worked as an imam for 7 years at the Islamic Society of Northern Wisconsin in Eau Claire, in a city called Altoona, which congregated about 40 different families within the area, particularly congregants that were working with healthcare in the Mayo Clinic and also at Eau Claire University. So a lot of professors, a lot of nursing students, physicians and surgeons were people that I served as an imam to, and currently working as the lead Muslim chaplain at M Health Fairview, the University of Minnesota Medical Center. And I office on the West Bank, and I do cover Muslim patient visits throughout the healthcare system at other hospitals as well on an as-need basis. A little bit about some of my education background. So I was born and raised in Minnesota, Minneapolis. Born at the same hospital that I work at coincidentally now, which is really cool. My parents migrated from Egypt in the 1970s. Around 1975 is where they came to Minneapolis to call their home for the next 40 some years or so. And started out education-wise, Islamically, I attended some of the local mosques and universities that were here, such as the Islamic University of Minnesota, Al-Maghrib Institute, and then I decided to formalize my education through the Islamic University of North America, Mishka. And I received a bachelor's in Islamic studies from them, and currently am pursuing a Master's of Divinity with a focus on Islamic chaplaincy through Bayan Islamic Graduate School and their sister school, Chicago Theological Seminary. So I had the great honor of receiving a scholarship through Muhammad Ali, who's the boxer, who passed away some time ago. His late wife, Khalila, partnered with Bayan for a grant for a spiritual leadership scholarship, which I applied to and I actually received from her, and I'm very grateful to be able to do this. And it helps me with the work that we will be discussing today in this presentation. And Sheikh Aisha was will also be presenting and has allowed time for questions and answers that will take place later on in our presentation. So you will have time to ask questions and discuss with us the material that we'll be presenting today. So moving forward, care of Muslim patients, some aspects of Muslim patient care. And some of these images are just mosques and different places of worship and some Islamic calligraphy or Islamic geometrics that I chose for the presentation. So some aspects of Muslim patient care. One of the things that I like to start out with is to discuss life itself and the sacredness of life in general. And it's not just the life of a Muslim person, life everywhere, and all human beings of every faith or every religion. So the preservation of life in Islam overrides all matters, meaning that if I am so sick that I am unable to stand up or pray or worship, then I'm unable to do those actions. So therefore, religion is put aside until I get better, or until I were to pass or something like that. But the preservation of this life is so sacred that it is taken into consideration in many, many matters when it comes to Islamic biomedical ethics. So for example, I like to use the example of someone fasting the month of Ramadan, and let's say that they're, they have type 2 diabetes and they're unable to fast the day due to fatigue and sickness and blood sugar and so on. So that person is exempt from the fasting, such as nursing mothers would be also exempt from fasting the month of Ramadan, and pregnant mothers and so on and so forth, many exemptions. For the traveler, someone who's traveling would not have to fast. So Islam really looks at the life of a person at whole. Another example I like to give is that if the call to prayer comes in for a Muslim and we're supposed to pray one of our 5 daily prayers, and food is set on the table and ready to eat, then it is actually recommended for us to sit down and eat first before we pray. So food is taking precedence over the prayer. Why? Because the satisfaction of our basic needs, our life, takes precedence over that. So we'll sanctify that desire, take care of it, and now we'll be able to focus on the religion and pray and worship God. Islam puts the onus or the responsibility on every individual. So you'll see levels of people practicing Islam at different places in their life, different levels, different, some people are more devout than others. Some people are more lax or liberal in some of their practices. So we come from all walks of life and all different places and different styles. So just to give that presentation that there's not really like a clergy in Islam, and there's everyone is responsible for themselves and responsible unto Allah, who is God, the Lord. Also like to talk about cleanliness in Islam, or tahara, which is the purification of, for example, ablution, the purification of the limbs, the face, the body before prayers. So being able to have, very important for Muslim patients to have, to be free of any types of impurities. And impurities could be certain types of blood or urine or fecal matter. So having these things taken care of for Muslim patients while they're in the hospital, to have them wiped from their bodies if possible. We know in some cases that it might not work that way, or but we try our best to be able to purify ourselves. So, and purifying the environment around them. So that means like that the environment around them is clean and sanitary from those above listed items such as urine and so on. Islam has a strong emphasis on the visitation of the sick. So for example, a lot of local imams or congregants, board members of different mosques are encouraged to visit the sick. Not only them, but it puts the responsibility on the congregation. So members of the congregation or members of family or relatives should be encouraged to go out and visit. And one of the narrations I would like to share with you is a hadith or a narration of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he mentions that when a person goes to visit the sick Muslim, and they do this, they go out and embark, and when they walk on that path to visit them, it's as if they were walking on a path to paradise. And when they arrive to the sick person and they sit, it's as if that they're being showered by the mercy of God. And if that's done in the morning, 70,000 angels will send peace and blessings and ask for forgiveness for them until the evening. And if it's done in the evening, 70,000 angels will send prayers and blessings and ask for their forgiveness until the morning. And what a blessing it is for me to be able to do this on a daily basis. What an honor and virtue that is given to us Muslims here in the United States to have this as an occupation. You know, obviously as a chaplain, we're providing much more than just visiting the sick, doing a lot of different types of reflective conversation, empathic listening, processing illness and diagnosis and prognosis. On top of all that, we're also providing that spiritual care, that comfort, that Arabic tongue for some patients that are unable to speak English, for example, the recitation of the Quran that can't be done necessarily by someone who's of a different denomination or a different faith in chaplaincy. Also, one of the things in medicine is if the choice exists to not have any type of pork products or intoxicants in the medication, then that should be given precedence. Now, a lot of some of the things in healthcare have to do with intoxicants, or what Muslims would call intoxicants, or khamr. However, there are concessions given due to the preservation of life. So For example, if a Muslim needs some type of sedation to have a surgery performed, then that would be acceptable. Although these items that are being used are considered intoxicants, but under this preservation of life, it would be acceptable to do so. Also, a lot of Muslim patients deny heparin, for example, for the heart, just because it's pork derived. But if this is the best medication on the market for heart patients with particular illnesses, then there shouldn't be no reason why a Muslim would reject that. But it's understood, I would say, generally, publicly, some Muslims would not do that. And I like to be able to educate and give light to the concessions that are given in Islam with regard to healthcare. Moving on, some other aspects here. So at the hospital I work at, approximately 73% of the employees are female. So with regard to Muslim patient care for Muslims who are male or Muslims who are female, it's best whenever possible to pair the caregivers with the same gender patient. So male on male care provider with a male Muslim patient, and also the same with females. Now, if this is not possible due to the demographics that I mentioned, then there's concession because of preservation of life. So it would be permissible that there would be a caregiver who's female, who's giving care to a male patient. There are some things that caregivers need to be aware of, and I particularly like to involve the healthcare team on my units that I visit in the conversation about modesty in Islam, or what is the awda, or awda is considered the private area of a Muslim, and it's different for males and females. And so, for example, for males, it would be from the navel to the knees. That would be considered all private area. So this should not be exposed to either the opposite gender or the same gender. And this might be against what is considered publicly acceptable. So for example, when I go to a Lifetime Fitness and I'm gonna work out and I'm in the locker room, I make sure that there's a towel around my navel to my knees before I change. And that's how I change myself so that I can uphold this sacredness of our private area. And the same for females would be, the difference would be is that awda for females is almost the entire body, pretty much the entire body. But female on female, it would be also, it'd be like from the chest or shoulders down to the knees would be acceptable for other females to see. So when it comes to, for example, changing the sheets or changing the bedding and things like that underneath patients that are identifying as Muslim, just to do so in a manner that's modest. So for example, when we wash the bodies of the deceased, we use male Muslim, males to wash male bodies. And when we wash the bodies, we put a towel over the awda, over that navel to the knees. And we pour the water over the towel. The towel can get wet, but we will not see the modesty of our beloved one who has departed. So just something to be sensitive about when thinking about your professions and moving on into the healthcare field. When working with Muslim patients, it goes a long ways. I can't say how considerate this is for these families. And if you know this and you build rapport with the family through this, then you have a really great connection. And it also helps with the hospitals receiving more Muslim patients in the future when the word gets out, and so on and so forth. So customer satisfaction, so to speak. You'll notice for some female Muslim patients, modesty is something that is to be upheld a little bit more, so to speak. Or you will find that, for example, you might find that female Muslim patients may not be making eye contact with you as much. And that's also contradictory to what we are considering as engaging. So when I look at you in the eye, that means I'm engaged in conversation. But now if I look away and I'm not making eye contact with you, that's seen as something that is not beloved in American culture. But just know that when you find that with Muslim patients, so if there's a female care provider and a male care provider and the male is not looking, it's not out of disrespect, it's actually out of honor. It's actually out of honor that these Muslims are doing that, because they hold these boundaries so sacred that they feel that the beauty of others is to be enjoyed by other than them. So particularly, in marriage and so on. For Muslim men growing the beard, the majority of the scholars consider this as obligatory or mandatory. So following in the footsteps of Moses, Abraham, Jesus, peace be upon them all, growing the beard is considered a religious act. For preservation of life, it may be removed. So for example, when I had a surgery and I had to have a mask on my face for the anesthesiologist, and it could not be blocked because of my hairs, I did shave my beard, because that's for the preservation of my life. There has also been fatwas or religious verdicts given during COVID-19 to be fit tested for N95 in the hospital for physicians and healthcare workers, that they have an exemption to remove the beard from this area so that the mask fits the face properly. And that's something I have considered, and it would be permissible for me to do in this case. But because my hospital provides what's called the PAPR, the large sort of like astronaut-shaped headgear with the respirator, I wear that to avoid shaving the beard. If I didn't have that, I would absolutely shave the beard, no problem.
I just get access to something here. They wanted me to.
And feel free to jot down any notes that you see, any points that you see to ask about later if you would like. So birth in Islam. We'll talk a little bit about some sensitive topics that are currently being discussed in media and in politics. And I just want to give you the Muslim perspective on some of these things. So reversible contraception is considered to be acceptable, which means it would not be a sin to do so if you were to use, for example, IUDs or condoms or pills. However, permanent contraception is considered haram or impermissible in Islam, unlawful. Unless, of course, in the case of hysterectomy because of cancer and so on, or in the case that if, for example, if someone was to become pregnant, it would cause them great harm and so on. There are very small exemptions from this, but in general, to have irreversible contraception is forbidden in Islam. Termination of pregnancy is mandatory if the pregnancy constitutes a serious threat to the life of the mother. So if the mother is possibly going to pass away due to giving birth or being pregnant, then irrespective of the gestation period, termination can take place. It's not an easy thing to be considered, but this is the Islamic ruling in that regard. and also situations that have severe congenital abnormalities can be considered for termination, although that's something to be discussed with the healthcare team, with a Muslim scholar, and particularly if we have Muslim scholars who are versed in healthcare, to be able to answer those questions as to whether or not parents can take this decision. So in Islam, the fetus is considered viable around 120 days, which is approximately 17.14 weeks. Viable meaning in the sense that this is the life of a child that has become a human being in all regards. So if that's the case, now the baby at 17 weeks wouldn't survive. I think it'd be closer to 23 weeks gestation where a child would survive. But for considering the Islamic perspective means that this child now has certain rights upon their family, their parents. And the rights are to be named with a beautiful name. So Muslims believe that you're given a name that you will live into, you know. So for example, my name is Tamer, which some would consider to be the Egyptian pronunciation, and the actual term is like Tamar, or the date giver, somebody who gives fruit dates out. Well, at age 40, I got to fulfill a Ramadan date distribution in our hospital. So I felt like I lived into that name. So the right of a child here is to be named a beautiful name, and also to be given proper washing and burial. So this is really important. And I'm sure you've heard of in different religious contexts, like a naming ceremony for the child. This is not that, but it's to name the child also on their death certificate and so on, and to have a proper burial for them, and to have a janazah, which is a funeral prayer. The placenta can also be given to the family for the disposal or burial as well, or the hospital can also dispose of it properly, which is probably the majority of cases. At birth, the adhan can be recited into the right ear of the child. So this is the first thing that they hear is, God is great, Muhammad is the messenger of God, come to the prayer, come to success. And these are the first words that they're hearing, which is hoped that the child will answer that call one day, will be able to come to the prayer that day, someday when they become of age. And also, you might find that in the hospital when they're having a child, they might call a chaplain, a Muslim chaplain or an imam to come and do this. Oftentimes, you'll find the families also giving a little bit of dates, sort of like moistened dates, the inside, and put into the baby's mouth to have the very first taste will be of dates. And this was a practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And many of if you mention this to the healthcare staff and so on, it can even be facilitated. And there's really no danger in doing so as long as it's not a big piece or a whole date or so on. It's also recommended to shave the head of the newborn child. So you can do so with clippers, or you can shave if you're very careful, and this is regardless of gender, so male or female. And then what can be done is something that is also recommended is to take that hair and weigh it and have the weight of it in gold or silver given out as a charity in thanksgiving for having this child, that God gifted us this newborn baby, and so we wish to give in thanksgiving to the poor. Circumcision is also to be performed on male children. It can be done on the 7th day. It could be done at different times. It kind of varies. A very strange case that was brought to me actually from another hospital. It wasn't our healthcare system, but through a chaplain that I knew. he had asked me about, in the case of a child born with both sexual organs. And the healthcare team actually wanted to preserve, the parents said, well, if we have both sexual organs, we need to circumcise the one that needs to be circumcised, the male side of it. And the healthcare team was like, hey, but we might need that foreskin to perform an operation later on if it is determined that the child is female. So what do you do in this case? What is the Islamic verdict here? Preservation of life will take precedence, right? That's kind of the theme here. So I made sure to let the team know, or let that chaplain know that this would be advisable to heed the advice of the healthcare team here and to make that exemption of the circumcision at that time. Also, we have the last bullet point, female genital mutilation or circumcision is something that is not permissible in Islam. And it's also illegal under US law. And it's been banned in many Muslim countries as well. And it's just me saying here that this is not something that is practiced, not something to be practiced by Muslims, and not something that is encouraged in religion. Even though it's done in some Muslim countries like Egypt and Somalia and others. So there's a difference. We have to place the difference between culture and religion, and they're two different things. Muslims' diet, we talked a little bit about this, so I won't go in so much detail, but I'll just mention a couple of things. Obviously, the flesh of swine is forbidden for Muslims to consume. Alcohol, THC, intoxicants of any kind are prohibited, unless, of course, it's prescribed by a physician for healthcare benefits. Some Muslims only eat just strictly certified halal, or what's called the dhabiha, which is the meat that's slaughtered by Muslims and mentioning the name of Allah upon the animal before the sacrifice. So a lot of places will have halal certified meat where Muslims can pick it up, such as Holy Land is one of the famous ones in the Twin Cities. We also have at Walmart now, it's available. Restaurant Depot, if you want to buy a large amount of halal meat. And even some of the restaurants locally in Minneapolis have halal as an option now. I would like to advocate for hospitals, since they're serving vegan and vegetarian and kosher, that certified halal also be the next accommodation for patients in their hospitals. And Muslims are allowed to eat dairy products and seafood. When I say seafood, anything in the ocean is free game. So I've actually had, when I was in Egypt, I've actually had shark meat, which was quite delicious. Somewhere between the texture of fish and calamari, I would say, is the profile. More serious topic into the end of life. This is a very sensitive subject, and there's really no cookie cutter answer that can be given on many of the cases that have been presented to me, because they're all different, they all have their nuances. But if we were to generalize, we can say that once the treatment has intensified to save a patient's life, it can't be turned off unless it is at the recommendation of a physician. I would say 3 physicians, that the inevitability of death is going to take place. And then also Islamic law would allow the withdrawal of futile treatment, what we would consider ongoing, unnecessary mechanical sustenance, if you will. So I had a case, for example, where there was a patient on ECMO. So they have a blood machine oxygenating their blood, and they were also on the ventilator, so intubated, receiving oxygen directly into the lungs. And it was quite sad because when we got to the care conference and we're talking to the family, they're saying that even after receiving the x-rays from neurology, that this is brain death, they were like, still don't take off the machine. And the physicians are like, no, it's actually against Minnesota law to keep going, and it's unethical. And so to what extent are we gonna be pushing? So that what I wanna say is you will encounter Muslims who are afraid to turn off the switch, so to speak, because there's a responsibility here that this is a family member, and then if we decide that, we are the ones killing them. We are the ones taking their life. And so my job as a chaplain is to come in and try to reframe this. Like, no, actually, the cause of death was COVID-19. Your loved one got an infection in their lungs, which deteriorated the lungs, dried them up to a point that that's it. They couldn't breathe on their own. The machine is pumping this. And obviously we're gonna do it in a very caring and kind and delicate way. But just for purposes of education, I'm just walking you through some of the instances that I've seen. So just know in that case, it would be totally permissible to take that off. Death. So you'll often hear sometimes that, when death is coming or when patients are talking about death or their families, they say, it's something destined by Allah. قَدَّرَ اللَّهُ مَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ. This is what Allah decrees and what He wishes. And that's certainly true. And that's an appointed time that no one knows. That's the other thing that comes out, like, just to be aware of when you come to a Muslim family and you say, you're gonna talk about death, well, be ready because they're gonna respond by saying, only Allah knows when they will die, right? So take that into consideration when visiting with patients, talking about this subject. Sort of a way to buffer that is just to allow, to give a reminder that death is something natural and is a transition into the afterlife, into the hereafter. A transition that this is a call from God to go back to Him. Other times you might find that the family appears very calm and very accepting. So there's the other extreme where, or I wouldn't even say extreme, I would say that's ideal, if possible, to be as calm and accepting as you can, because that's the most virtue. Muslims are prohibited from wailing or screaming. You can cry, you could even cry with sound, but to do it in a way that's very animated way and very loud is prohibited in Islam. So I oftentimes will try to bring a calm presence into the room and try to recite the creed, there's no God but Allah, in front of them. And we all belong to Allah, and to Allah we will return. And just give that reminder in that time of stress and hardship. Oftentimes, if a patient's in a coma, you can face them towards Mecca. So if they're lying on their side, face their right side towards Mecca, so northeast. If they're unable to lie on their side, they're lying on their back, you can face them towards Mecca by their feet, northeast, approximately 43 degrees. And you can find this from a compass or on your digital device or your phone. Oftentimes, you'll find that Muslim patients will ask for the recitation of the Quran upon the dying patient. So I've been called to recite, for example, chapter 36 is one that Muslim families will oftentimes ask me to recite. And there's, prayers that I'll recite as well. For the dying, it's said that this could help the ease of passage. Surah Yasin, the chapter of Yasin in the Quran. Also for patients who have just died, to face them towards Mecca. I would say those who are going into nursing, something to be aware of is, if you've ever seen a dead patient before, oftentimes the jaw will drop and the eyes are open, and you can walk into the room and be absolutely terrified, if I'm gonna be frank. So what Muslims are recommended to do is respect the deceased as if they were alive. So what we like to do is have the jaw, I oftentimes will ask the nurse to create like a wrap around the jaw to the head to hold the jaw in place before rigor mortis sets in, so that when it does, the mouth will remain closed and obviously the eyes closed as well. And to cover the deceased with a sheet, to make sure that they're covered. Now, if there's people coming to visit, the head may be uncovered. They may kiss their deceased or hug their deceased and so on. But to give the utmost respect to the body as if it's alive. And that's the same thing with the aura, as I mentioned before. So from the navel to the knees for men and the entire body for a woman to be covered at all times. Also, there's no need to perform any ritual bathing at the hospital itself, because Muslim community centers are facilitated and equipped with the ritual bathing facilities. So there's a few in the Twin Cities. Closest one to here would be the Maplewood Mosque, which is the Islamic Institute of Minnesota. And that's in Maplewood. There's another one in Burnsville, another one in Columbia Heights. I believe there's a fourth one in Bloomington. So those are sort of the centralized locations where people can wash their deceased, and then based on where they want them buried and so on. So burials are to be performed as soon as possible. This is very similar to Jewish tradition as well. And cremation is prohibited. Autopsy. So I did want to talk about this because I actually had a case where a 5-year-old child had unfortunately been somehow got into the swimming pool of their apartments. And 30 minutes later, when the family went to go find him, they just found his clothes sitting at the edge of the pool. And then they found the child had passed away. They were brought back to the hospital. And my colleague chaplain called our director. My director called me. It's off hours, but he's like, hey, if you can come in, this is a serious case. So obviously I was like, yes. I put on my clothes, I went down, I drove, and I was there from probably 7 p.m. till 11 p.m. Why? Because this particular case had a lot of dynamic to it, where you had the siblings. So this was the youngest child, and then you have the siblings who are older in their teens and into their 20s. So just absolutely devastated that their youngest child passed away, their youngest sibling. And then the parents are there. So mom and dad are there, and they're just inconsolable. What can you say? On top of that, add the dynamic that you have law enforcement there, and they need pictures, and they need an autopsy, and they need all of this to be done. And then you have the family saying, no, we're not gonna let you take the organs of our child. Because there's a mistrust here of the healthcare system, we have to understand. They're thinking that now our child is a cadaver, that's what an autopsy is. They're gonna take his organs away and then they're gonna give them back to us. And then no, we have to clear up these misconceptions, and who better to have at that point than someone who's like an imam or a chaplain, or to be able to build that trust between the healthcare team and the family. I mean, I can't say how invaluable that is to have that in every hospital setting where we have a large Muslim demographics. So major concerns like the one mentioned with regard to organ donation or organ harvesting that they were thinking is they're thinking that there's disrespect here for the deceased. You're going to make an incision into our loved one, and we are respecting him as if he's alive. So no, you're not going to do that. That's one concern. That's also going to delay the burial process. And then, is this permissible or not? Is the other question. So when I was there, I was able to clarify these things by saying, yeah, it's necessary to establish the cause of death. We want to rule out any doubt, any other possibility that want to make sure that it was that your child actually drowned and no one else harmed him. And I'm not saying that it's you two, we're saying, what if somebody else was around? What if someone pushed him into the pool or something like that? We have to figure out these things. Autopsy can also be done if there's a significant public health interest, or if it's required by law in the circumstance that I mentioned. Muslims may accept blood transfusions and also transplants of human organs. Weird concerns that I've actually heard is, oh, can I take blood from someone who's non-Muslim? You know, is that acceptable? There's really no basis as to why that wouldn't be. We're all human beings. We all bleed the same colored blood. I understand why they might think something like that, but there's really no foundation for that. So I consider it to be acceptable. Human organ transplant, I had a case where it was just so touching to see, really, because I saw one patient who was the donor had basically donated a kidney, and I don't have any context, but I said, oh, do you know anything about the recipient? And they're like, yeah, that's my best friend. And the reason why I did this was because they're raising money on Facebook to have a kidney transplant. And I thought, instead of giving money, why don't I just give her my kidney? you know? And I thought, wow, what a beautiful bond that the faith brought them together, and that they, from two different continents, and then they come to the United States, they become best friends, and then so they're essentially, we believe that they were given to us by God. So it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to Allah. And so therefore you can't give it. However, the opinion that I would follow myself is that it would be considered acceptable to do so as long as the modesty and preservation of the Muslim who is deceased will be preserved. So making sure that the patient's covered and only people who are taking the organs will do so.
That's okay. I got it. All right.
I think the screen didn't come back. The screen didn't come back. The one that I made.
That's okay.
So moving on here. So withdrawal of treatment, we spoke a little bit about. So just know it's a challenge for all families, not just Muslims. We see it with all family members. So for example, Sundays I work on call in more of an interfaith capacity where I do visit patients that are not Muslim. And, I could speak about sort of the dynamic of balancing that out between my faith and others. But I won't take too much time in that because it's not the subject. But I do see families, Muslims, Christians, people that don't necessarily identify with the faith. The reactions are very much the same. So the confusion sets in is when they're withdrawing and taking off ECMO or the ventilator and things like that. That is this euthanasia or is this withdrawal? Is this suicide? They're trying to figure out what are we doing here, and again. One of my capacities is to try to reframe that for the Muslim patients. If it's deemed acceptable within the Islamic boundaries. We've had, praise be to God, just a couple of breakthrough cases that I've had with the team where, all of the criteria was met where the patient did need to pass on their own naturally, and we're able to get there. It's a very hard place to get to, but we were able to do it by the grace of Allah. So the opinions I put here, 2 doctors or 2 specialists, I would even say 3 would be considered a more acceptable amount by Muslim scholars. So 3 specialists who can identify the inevitability of death or that treatment is now futile. And if that is mentioned, then it would be acceptable to take that and make that decision. Also, just being clear, what I've found oftentimes with healthcare teams that I've worked with in the intensive care units is that I'll ask them to be as open as possible with the families. So that also means like making sure that the family understands English well, having interpreters available, which we do, but identifying those needs early on so that you can convey these things. Oftentimes with Muslim families, you'll find that when you're discussing, when it gets to the point of when you're having a care conference, essentially discussing where this is going to go, you will find that oftentimes one family member, if not 2, is in healthcare. So you also have to recognize that these are people that are working in the same field, and so they're gonna have some pushback too, because now you're dealing with an expert essentially in the family. So. Just some things to consider, not to point the soles of your feet towards the patients or towards family. In culture, it's considered disrespectful. Islamically, not, but just to say culture is different from the religion, that's considered disrespectful. We mentioned some of the concessions of fasting. So in compliance of medication. I've even had mental health patients that need to take their medications when they're in the hospital, and they're worried about fasting in Ramadan. They're like trying to fast, like, no, I can't take my medicine because I gotta fast. It's like, no, Islam also considers mental illness as an illness. So go ahead, take your medication, break your fast, and when you're better, someday when you're better, you'll be able to fast those days and make them up, throughout the year, anytime during the year. So just offering that validation of you're gonna be okay, this is not sinful for you, to break your fast at this time, it's okay, it's for the preservation of your life again. It's always gonna take precedence, always gonna be at the top. So also considering elders of the community, elder members, to include them in these conversations because they're considered respectable members of the community and their opinion holds weight. And then the simple ask is if they want to see an imam or a Muslim chaplain. Resources that are available, and I would hope to be available at your hospitals that you, or clinics where you hope to work at someday, is just like pointing out a place where that they can do their 5 daily prayers other than the actual room. Because maybe they need that spiritual reset. They need to get outside, get away from the commotion of the room or the grief that they're going through with their loved one, and just be able to have some good headspace and reconnect with Allah. So offering a meditation space for their 5 daily prayers, offering a copy of the Quran. At our hospital, we have a copy that's in Arabic and a copy that's in English. It's also widely known that Muslims know how to read the Quran in Arabic, regardless of what ethnic background they're from. So they will, particularly the Somali community, oftentimes I don't need an interpreter. I would say 50% of the time, because they speak Arabic and I also speak Arabic. So I'm able to communicate with them without the means of an interpreter. So you can offer a Quran in Arabic most of the time to Somali families and patients, and also to Urdu speaking families from like Pakistan, India, Indonesia, many Muslim countries where they'll be able to read from the Arabic copy. Otherwise, you can give the English copy. A lot of times there's people who come to Islam from other faiths and other backgrounds. So the English copy would be the sufficient copy. Offering a prayer rug too. So if they want to pray in their room, they don't want to leave their loved one, such as in the example of, a father that might not want to leave the side of their child who was just born. They're so excited, so happy, like, I'm not going anywhere. I just want to pray next to him. So you can offer a prayer rug. A lot of times people think they're very expensive. You can find places like that would donate. So some of the places we get our donations from are business owners of like in the Somali Mall, where they just want to help and benefit Muslim patient families. Also, prayer rugs that are pocket prayer rugs made out of like polyester, can be sanitized for later. Those are ones that we use at the hospital, are easy to distribute and carry. Islamic prayer books, I have one with me here. This was authored by Imam Sharif Muhammad, who is who used to work at the University Hospital, is now Imam, continued work as an Imam at the Dar al-Hijra on Cedar Riverside. He made this copy, which has like supplications from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and some verses of the Quran that might help console patients. This is in English and Arabic. All right, and then last but not least, just some vocabulary. So ask yourself, like, what is going to be your key to this visit, or to introduce yourself to these families? You might want to be aware of some of the vocabulary of what you might be able to use. So for example, saying assalamu alaikum, or saying salam, peace be unto you, or peace is a good start. You might hear patients say alhamdulillah, which means all praise be to Allah. You might hear patients say bismillah, which means in the name of Allah, and we say this before we drink or before we eat. Dua means supplications, so this is different than the 5 daily prayers. Supplications can be said like in any state. You don't have to make ablution for it. You can just supplicate and invoke God in any time. That's something that they also would use. Hadith, these are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Insha'Allah also means God willing. A masjid is a mosque, and salah is worship, and that's the form of the 5 daily prayers. I think that's all that I have for this presentation for today. So again, thank you very much. I'm sure that you have many questions, comments, and appreciate the invitation. And without further ado, we'll allow Sheikh Aisha to take the stand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imam Temer. That was actually outstanding. And the stories, so many stories. I know, being used to work also at Hennepin County, the hospital, sometimes as a chaplain there. I know how very exhausting that can be. So especially when we're talking about death. My lecture is going to be in 5 minutes from now, so I'm going to give you guys a break. I know there's some great raspberry lemonade, and we'll continue in 5 minutes. So take your break, get your juice or whatever it is, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Was the sound actually clear on the live? On your the things, and slightly different from the things that, just give me a second. A little bit of technical issues. All right, so I will be speaking about a number of different issues. Some of them, let's just say we're completing each other's work. And I do actually have the slide for those that are interested in looking at the slide directly in their phone, probably, or in their screen. They could just take that QR code and have access to all the PowerPoint. The goal for my talk is going to be slightly different in where there are the general guidelines for health services and the Islamic traditions that affect the healthcare, and then finally some additional resources that Imam Tamer was talking about. Of course, we know that in general, when we're looking at the Muslim population, there is generally yes, a general name Muslim, but it's really important to mention that Muslims actually come from various backgrounds, and Muslim patients at many times can actually have different, let me say, different cultures, and what impacts a lot of the different views about a number of different things. We'll talk about that in just a bit. And of course, Muslims believe that all life that everything in life, and that life is actually sacred, and it should be considered as the number one priority. And it's really important to understand when we're speaking about Muslim patients, there's always that legal maxim in the background. In other words, there's this, you could call it like the vertebra of what makes an Islamic thinking. And of course, it actually goes into 5 main categories, which is the preservation of religion or spirituality, the preservation of nafs and life, and preservation of health, and the preservation of mind and mental health, preservation of chastity and family, and finally the preservation of wealth. Now, if you actually look into these 5 categories, those are actually in that order. So the preservation of religion comes before the preservation of life. But when life is actually in danger, religion takes in that position to let, of course, the preservation of life take priority. And the same thing when we're speaking about chastity and family, and et cetera, we're looking at these different orders as considering them as the main 5 legal maxims. In Islam, there are certain religious observations that require some attention, whether we're speaking about purification. He talked about ablution, or some certain practices of how Muslims actually wash for their prayer. I think it's really important to mention, because sometimes I remember even when I was in high school, when I would go to the women's restroom and they would see me washing my face or washing my feet, they would definitely get so confused as, why is she doing this and why here? And it becomes very confusing for somebody that is not familiar with the washing before, or the ritual washing before prayer. So just wanted to put it out there so you could see what it actually looks like, so that you're not thinking that this person is somehow going into psychosis or some kind of an imagination, because I've had actually some cases, and I also do prison chaplaincy, where there was a lot of confusion when they had seen Muslims actually washing. They were confused as to what they were doing, and of course that didn't always end in a happy ending in a prison. Of course, in the case of absence of water, or when the water usage is not recommended, there is the dry ablution or dry ritual ablution, and that is actually in replacement for washing, and the person can just simply use something like soil or sand, and even a rock. So the person can use a rock, get a small rock, and actually use it as a soap if you would want to, kind of like a bar soap or something. And that would be a replacement for
for a complete water usage, but of course there's a specific way to do it. The other part is when we're talking about prayer, dietary needs. I'm not going to talk about each and every single one, but just a number of different things. Muslims pray 5 times a day. Of course, there are some people who are exempt, whether we're speaking about women, specifically women, during their cycle times, and of course during their postpartum times. Women tend to have a lot of questions regarding that, especially for OBs and women or OBs working with Muslim women. There tend to be a lot of questions regarding whether this is a cycle or whether this is a postpartum. So this is an issue. I would like to point out that in Islamic law, it's totally different than what is perceived as a period in medical terms. There are three different types of bleeding for women, and some of that bleeding women do not actually pray during that time, whether it's postnatal bleeding or whether it's a cycle bleeding. But there is a different type of bleeding, which is called istihada, where women actually observe prayer and actually fast normally. So there's a lot of details on that, but I'm just going to, just make it clear, because a lot of women, especially when they go to their OBs, they would expect their OB to know the answer, or sometimes they're confused and would ask the question, so is this a cycle or not? How do I understand this? This bleeding. The other people that are exempted are people during their if they are, of course, terminally ill. They're exempted from doing all the different movements. They can do partial movements. So that would be something that would be really helpful to assist the Muslim patient during those situations. Prayers are generally performed most of the times on a mat, on a prayer mat, and includes various movements such as bowing, prostrating, and sitting. And of course, it's not necessary for an ill patient to make all the movements, all the usual movements, but they can make some of those movements, and sometimes they could even, if they are not capable of getting up and actually moving, like whether it's bending or whether it's prostrating, they can actually stay in bed, even if that meant to move their eyelids, even if they were making a gesture with their eyelids, but they still have to perform the prayer. People that have mental illnesses, not all mental illnesses, we're going to talk about that later on, not all mental illnesses are treated the same way. Of course, there are certain there is some attention to dietary needs. We'll talk about the dietary needs. Muslims, of course, are required. You had mentioned halal diet, and I'm not going to go in details with that. Talking about chaplaincy services, many times women, especially women, they can have, I would say, some how can I explain or even use the word, but I would say they would be very sensitive about having a male chaplain or even a male provider. So offering a female for a female is always recommended. And of course, even if it's a Muslim chaplain, there's sometimes that sensitivity towards having a male provider. Men are usually not as sensitive towards women, but this is for a number of different reasons related to modesty. Hygiene, of course, there's that washing with water after urination or using the bathroom, trimming the different parts of the body part, especially if we're talking about patients that might actually stay for prolonged times. Trimming or removing armpit, pubic hair on a regular basis is actually part of the Muslim hygiene. Keeping the nostrils clean, keeping fingernails trimmed and clean. Toilet, it's really important that toilets should be equipped with a small water container to assist with washing. A water container should be made available to a bedbound Muslim patient whenever they're actually at the bed. Administration of medicines. This is a very important issue because when we're talking about medications, it can be confusing for many Muslim patients, especially that they may not know the different ingredients and what those ingredients are actually meaning or where their resources are. So there could be sometimes that sensitivity, feeling that what if it contained pork? What if this contained, and of course, this is very common that many Muslims are actually refusing vaccinations because there's some aborted fetuses or something within those vaccines. So many Muslim patients will actually abstain to take from those vaccines and feel that it's probably going to cause autism, or it's going to cause some kind of a harm in my body, etc. So in that situation, it's really important to explain. It's very important to explain why this is necessary and how this is actually bringing in a lot of numbers, or let's say a better chance of less disease and a less chance of getting contaminated or different things. So sometimes explaining to them what it actually does is really important, and how it had prevented lots of illnesses in order to preserve the body and preserve the health is actually one way to bring about that explanation, rather than feel that no, even if it contains pork, it's still supposed to be something that you have to take. So, you know, of course, it's not going to be said in that way, but many times you will find Muslim patients somehow being sensitive towards taking different vaccines or medications. So it's really important to explain that piece of it right there. Medical examination and of course, modesty considerations. Modesty is very important in Islam for both men and women. So the best way to do it is, if there is a female provider for the women, you know, have that on site if it's possible. If not, things should be arranged, or at least offer them to have a chaperone with them, be within the room. Maternity services. Maternity services is probably, as a woman, you know, I would get a lot of women coming in there a lot of times confused about what rights do I have, and most of the times they're really concerned about having a male provider. So having a paper, for example, that says female only, or knocking at the door, or no men, or etc., having it on the door tends to actually be very helpful for women, because many times you can have probably the housekeeping or somebody, or maybe a nurse from a nurse coming in, not realizing that there's actually a woman that is really concerned about the modesty. So just make sure that is something that Muslim woman does actually consider as very important to them. We talked about, and Imam Tamer did actually talk about some of the abortion, miscarriage, shaving newborn, so I'm not going to go over that. A number of different things to talk about, which is foster care and adoption. Foster care and adoption, especially for orphans, is actually encouraged in Islam. However, under Islam, the child must always retain the name, the family name, and the biological family. For nursing and breastfeeding, mothers are encouraged to nurse their children for up to 2 years. Family relations, and this is really important to a number of different things within Islamic law, is that family relations extends farther than just biological parenting, because it also includes milk relations. So if a woman were to nurse a child, that child becomes her milk son, and all his brothers and his sisters, or whoever she milked, becomes a sibling to that particular child. And that's why whoever she nursed, they want to keep track of the the different family members or even keep track of that child, because down the road in the future, this child cannot marry any of her biological children or other children that she had nursed. So milk banks are discouraged due to the fact that such banks do not keep track of the lineage for that milk. Home visits. Dressing modestly is advisable, and taking off the shoes before entering homes, just because many times Muslims would be praying on the mat or on that carpet. So they want to make sure that nothing was contaminated with the shoes coming inside the home. Being alone with the opposite sex is prohibited in Islam. Therefore, do not be offended if the patient refused your entrance without a chaperone. Rehabilitation issues. Using right hand is extremely recommended, and Muslims, if many times if they had, let's say, they were amputees, their left hand was the only arm that they could use. So in that situation, giving them that help and comforting them that it's permissible in that situation, in understanding that why they're feeling that there's this issue, that they're sensitive about using their left hand is extremely important. Visiting arrangements. Visiting patients, especially relatives, is a Muslim duty and required by Islam. It is considered a communal obligation. And that's why expect large numbers of patients in hospitals or even in clinics, and discuss it with family members regarding visitation hours and other arrangements, because you're going to end up sometimes not understanding what's happening. Why are these people just pouring at the hospital? It's really because they feel sorry about that. They feel that it's a responsibility to be there in support of the family. Caring for the elderly is obligatory and, of course, a communal obligation. Family relations and enhancing them is a responsibility Muslims are very considerate of. I'm not going to go in lots of details about end-life issues. I think he did an outstanding job with end-life issues, so I'll skip some of those, but it's really important to just mention a number of different things. Many Muslims, of course, with the loss of loved one, they can be very stressed about it, and there are certain rites that need to be performed during and after death from these. For example, reading the Quran, facing the dying patient towards Mecca, giving sips of water to the dying patients, and sometimes giving sips of water, like getting the straw and just putting your finger on the end of it, and that way it sucks out the water, and just putting it inside their mouth. They also have, in hospitals, they have, I don't know what they call it, but it basically has a sponge on one end. It's a red sponge on one end, and it would have like a little stick holding onto it. You can put it inside, dip it inside the cup until it, of course, absorbs the water, and put it inside the person's mouth, because they're not able to sip. So that actually has been working great in where they're getting a good amount of water. So here's the thing, is that within healthcare services, they would tell you they don't need it. It's okay, because at the end, the body is discharging it. They're not probably going to be living any longer by taking in that water. But in Islam, they are actually advised to take in the water and to give sips of water, just so that they would die peacefully. So the Muslims are advised to give, whether it's make it a quiet place, only the people that this deceased is loving or wants to enter their area, or making whether it's a comfortable setting, whether with noise, comfortable setting, with who's around, comfortable setting. So you will have somebody that is reading, it's called Surah Yasin, to read Surah Yasin, because Muslims actually believe it comforts the person while they're dying. The sips of water, like I had mentioned, is actually extremely important, because it is mentioned in a number of different hadiths that the person, while they're dying, they're actually getting even more and more dehydrated. So to give them these sips of water is extremely important. Repeating La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. There's no God worthy of worship, and Allah is and Muhammad, sorry, so there is no God worthy of worship, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, is something that that Muslims need to, or even if a person is not Muslim, if you have a Muslim dying patient, please repeat it next to them. It will definitely give them comfort, and also comfort even the family members that they had somebody there to remind them of the word and the final word that they always had wished to say as their final word during their death. Death and dying, of course, for Muslims, there are a number of different cases that I actually got needing fatwa, and a fatwa, of course, actually means a religious answer to different questions relating to Islam. So if there is a case, and many times Muslims may not know who to ask regarding that situation, so I put right there mjaonline.org, and this website actually has a hotline fatwa, and it actually has a number of great scholars there. Some of them are actually medical experts as well, along with their Islamic degrees. So getting in contact, or at least informing the family that they could actually call or even contact this organization does actually make things a lot easier. Deceased patients, of course, it's really important. Position the patient, dealing with the deceased patient with gentle care, and care, of course, with the body, or even with the family. And of course, in the case of a death of a Muslim patient, the best choice is really to contact an Islamic organization to handle the situation, because there are a number of different rights in how we deal with the body. So considering contacting someone that can take care of the matter, whether reaching out to the family or whether in performing the different rites for washing and shrouding the dead, is actually the easiest way to do it. Autopsy, I'm going to skip all that. It's a number of different things for Muslim diet. We had mentioned pork, of course, and the derivatives. I would like to just mention one thing, is that many times, it's a lot easier because in certain cultures, you will find more sensitivity toward the word halal and what it really defines into. So you will have more the Indo-Pakistani and the Pakistani, Indo-Pakistani. So those areas are really considerate about what defines halal, and are really, I would say, they would have it narrowed down to more of within a specific type of a slaughter, sheep slaughter, or of course goat slaughter. Somalis tend to be a little bit, Somalis and Arab tend to be, I would say, a little bit more probably liberal on the term halal, I would say, because they would regard any type of a slaughtering that was done by Christian or Jew, or even if it was done, not necessarily the throat slit right away, that it would still be considered halal. If the slitting of the throat, of course, that is for that animal, was done a minute or two, of course, that is before it was even deceased right away. So you could, sometimes it's a lot easier to understand, well, why, in, all these different things, when you just keep in mind, they would consider a halal label. It has a specific definition for some, mainly, I would say, geographical, and the geographical had some historical / religious backgrounds to it. So I'll just make it easy and just say it that way. Holidays, there are certain major festivals, of course, Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, and of course pilgrimage, but there are some of those areas where I would say they do have some impact on healthcare providing, and specifically Ramadan and fasting. Ramadan, of course, Muslims are not permitted to eat, drink, including water, from dawn until dusk. And Muslims prepare for this, of course, a pre-dawn meal. It's really important to mention it's not just It's not just eating or drinking, but it's also sexual relations during the day from dawn until dusk. Pregnant, breastfeeding, or menstruating women or people who are experiencing temporary illness and travelers are exempted from fasting, but must make up their fast for a later date. I think it's really important to mention, as a woman, many times the pregnancy, breastfeeding, and menstruating women, especially when we're speaking about menstruating women, many times they're always concerned about, can they take contraceptive pills to delay their period during the month of Ramadan and stuff, and this becomes a very common issue. Yes, they can take those pills if they want to, although it's not necessarily recommended, but they can take those pills. Breastfeeding and pregnant women, they can actually be exempt from fasting, and this is really important to mention. They can be exempt from fasting, and if, of course, if there was some danger, let's say, or even if the pregnant woman or the nursing woman was feeling too dehydrated, feeling dizzy, etc., she can actually choose to make up her fast at later times. A person experiencing a chronic illness, of course, that is, if fasting would make their illness probably prolonged into the healing process, or if it affects them and it makes them even getting worse in their illness, and they can actually they can actually pay the fidya, the expiation, instead of fasting. They can pay and feed a poor person per every single day missed. Really quick, I hope I'm not going to of medication and intakes, of course, of medications. Fasting person may take the following medications, of course. One, non-feeding injections and blood tests. They can actually do that. It does not break their fast, but it's really important to mention that some scholars did actually consider that it does break the fast. So you might have some Muslim patients that will probably not want to take lidocaine for a toothache, for example, or take an injection, or probably take certain medications, and especially even injections or even pills or syrups, etc., because it does actually break their fast, at least the ones that are feeding, even if we're talking about suppositories and the suppositories and anything that involves any type of feeding the body, even if that was not necessarily a nutrient, it would actually break the fast. But if we're talking about injections that are not feeding the body, you will still find some Muslim patients not wanting to take those injections, even if it was just blood work, even if it's just a blood test. They will abstain because they would think and will be confused on whether it does break the fast or not. And of course, there are actually differences of opinions between scholars regarding that, but that's a different discussion. Gargling, as long as no liquid is swallowed, that's actually permissible. OB visits and pelvic exams. Some women may fear that pelvic exams may affect their fasting, although it does not, according to most scholars. Most Muslim women are asked to seek, of course, a female OB provider, yet under urgent circumstances, women may seek male healthcare providers and ask for the presence of a chaperone. I would like to mention that some women, I don't know if I mentioned it here, but there are some women that will abstain from pelvic exams during Ramadan because they would fear that it breaks their fast. And even though there's really no evidence that it does, but you just keep in mind that some women may actually fear that pap smear or even OB visit or even just the speculum itself, they will think that just by inserting the speculum that that's going to be breaking their fast, so they will choose not to visit the OB because of in fear of breaking their fast. Dressing, of course, dressing modestly is sacred in the Muslim religion for both men and women. Of course, I'm not going to go so much into that. Mental health or cognitive dysfunction. I want to actually focus a little bit on that. This is a very common thing right now. I do have a lecture on that. I'll share it in just a bit. For mental health in Islam, there are actually two different pathways. So the dysfunction of the cognitive skill, that's one pathway. And then the other pathway, which is, I would say, more of a social dysfunction, let's say it that way, there are actually two different areas. So for the person that had their cognitive ability dysfunctioned, those are the people that will be exempt from fasting, exempt from praying, and exempt from doing the different religious duties. But for the people that have a, let's call it a social dysfunction, all right? So whether we're talking about PTSD, or probably schizophrenia, all right? That's more of a social dysfunction, although yes, with schizophrenia, it goes within probably two parameters, but in the end is that for a person that is capable of having the cognitive skill to understand and apply to a certain extent, they would be obligated to fast, they would be obligated to perform certain religious duties, but of course, it depends on the case by case, it depends on the situation. So the patient's immediate family or extended family is usually responsible for the patient. They would help the patient understand a number of different things. It's really important to mention that when we're speaking about mental health in Muslim patients, many times mental illness is usually confused with a number of different unseen related illnesses. And by that, you will see a lot of Muslims that are confused, for example, about schizophrenia. They will think that it's jinn related, and jinn is basically demons, or even envy. And that if a person, for example, might go through some kind of a mental illness, anxiety, depression, that, oh, somebody actually envied me and now I'm a victim for that. So what I need to do is not seek, of course, this is the very common thing, is that many Muslim patients will refuse and will be in total denial to seek treatment for mental illnesses, and they would feel that there's actually some kind of an unseen related illness, and whether it's black magic or a result of somebody's sins or because some people want to harm them, and which is why when we're talking about psychology, it's really important to just understand how we can help a Muslim in understanding a number of different psychological issues here. So for a Muslim, of course, the most important healing way is thinking beyond materialistic life, thinking beyond the trauma, thinking beyond time. In other words, looking at the hereafter, thinking beyond people, and trying to focus on yourself rather than focusing on the people and how they can harm you, and thinking beyond place. Now, how to focus? Islam has its own way of how we actually focus in that. How we change the focus from thinking of a person to thinking about God Almighty, which is, of course, Muslims would do a form of dhikr. Dhikr is remembrance of God's power, in where they would do a repetitive visual. So it's a moment of thinking about God Almighty's power, probably beautiful nature pictures, or oral dhikr, where they're doing that oral remembrance and repeating God Almighty's names, for example, recognizing God Almighty's power, repeating the names of God Almighty, etc., and doing prayer. That's another way of how they try to focus on their soul and on hope rather than the materialistic weaknesses or themselves. Of course, other different things that they would do: invocation, dua, depend on and think of depending on God Almighty to take care of the matters rather than focusing on their own selves. The other part is, it's really important to understand is that many Muslims are actually in fear of psychiatric medications. And the reason for that is really believing that medication is not supposed to be healing a person from the the different visions or the different thoughts and consider that medication is just for physical disorder and believing that human behavior only has one dimension to it, which is law. And of course, there's that word ilm al-nafs, which is the science of nafs. And of course, this is actually very commonly confused with the psychology, in terms of the field of psychology, because historically speaking, the science of ilm al-nafs was actually taught as tazkiyah, or a heart purification. So for many Muslims, I would say Muslim laymen, they would think that somehow this is actually trying to inject a different faith, etc. And of course, the reason why many would actually fear psychiatric medications is really in fear of being called insane, being put as a lab test or something, fear of challenges from the rest of the community, and that may affect the social acceptance, the marriage, education, job, and so forth. I do actually have a lecture on mental health and Islam on YouTube. And it goes in lots of details and what's the difference between Islamic psychology and Western psychology. I think it's really important to go back to it to recognize the differences, especially if you are actually working with patients that are going through mental health issues and not necessarily the physical issues or physical issues or medical illnesses. Transplant and organ donation, I'm not going to talk about that. Generally speaking, most Muslims will abstain from organ donations, and the reason to it is really because of the lack of consideration of Islamic law in dealing with the Muslim corpse. So many will abstain, even though in Islam it is actually permissible to donate the organ on a condition that it does not harm the person himself, and that medically they are going to be safe to do so, but in certain circumstances, of course. But most of the times Muslim patients and Muslim families will actually abstain, and it is actually not advised to donate just because of the lack of consideration for Islamic law in dealing with the donor's body. Sexual and reproductive health, contraceptives in general are actually permissible to use. There are certain communities, I would say the Somali community in particular is really, I would say, sensitive about this issue. Palestinians as well, I would say, very sensitive about this issue and actually think of it as impermissible. And I would say I would go farther and say that they're very skeptic of anyone that even says that this is permissible, becomes a person of suspicion, because they would think many times that there's some kind of a conspiracy that they're actually involved in. So if we're talking about temporary contraceptives, it is actually permissible to use those different methods if they are temporary. However, permanent contraceptive methods such as vasectomy, tubal ligation are only allowed where the man or the woman's health is at risk from additional pregnancies. Abortion under Islam, of course, a fetus is considered alive after 120 days of gestation. Abortion is not permitted after this time unless the pregnancy constitutes a serious threat to the life of the mother. Abortion is permitted prior to 120 days only under certain circumstances. And this is actually a case by case. And there isn't a general ruling for when abortion is permitted before 120 days. It's a case by case situation. And of course, abortion is not permitted on the basis of family planning in general. You had actually mentioned for the female genital mutilation. I would like to just say, yes, female genital mutilation is forbidden, but it actually allows something called prepusectomy. Prepusectomy is different because it is actually taking something very similar to the foreskin, but this is actually taking from the foreskin, from the clitoris. And of course, it's very similar and I would say equivalent to it, but although it is actually permissible in Islam, it is definitely illegal in the US. So just wanted to mention that one, just to make it clear. Assistive reproductive technology. When we're speaking about the assisted reproductive technology, it's generally permitted in Islam. However, there are some techniques and practices that are not permitted, whether it's the use of donor sperm, it's strictly forbidden. The use of a sperm that has been cryopreserved is prohibited if the father has died. Surrogacy is not permitted whatsoever, and suicide and euthanasia. Islam considers human life and suicide and euthanasia are actually forbidden. So suicide and euthanasia for being forbidden, but if a patient is suffering from a terminal condition and has been assessed as having no hope of recovery, it is permitted to stop medical treatment. This is really important to keep in mind because many times they would say, no, it's haram to stop, and in that you have to continue treatment. It's actually the person's choice to continue treatment or not. Generally speaking, of course, there are important websites to go back to. This website is probably the most important website to go back to. It's called islamicfinder.org, because it will have the nearest, you just punch in your zip code, it will give you the nearest Islamic center, all the different areas to wash and stroke the dead, or even Islamic centers, or even probably any Islamic center. It could be a women's shelter, whatever it is. You'll actually find it in that islamicfinder.org. Islamic organizations to help with answering questions related to probably health or even other issues. There's actually this this fatwa hotline that you could call. The most famous Islamic center in Minnesota is really the eldest out of them, the Islamic Center of Minnesota. I mean, I used to go there in 1987, so a very long time. It was actually the first Islamic center in Minnesota. I think they had started renting it in 1969. And halal information really quick, certain things, halal meat, and we talked about that. He had mentioned it, milk and products. So I will actually, I'm just going to go really quick over that. Islamic organizations, there's that one. We do have a cemetery. We actually have 2 cemeteries now. The most famous one is really the Garden of Eden in Burnsville. There's another one in what's it called? Roseville, there you go. In Roseville, and of course, Islamic Finder, you will actually find all that. To get the QR codes for all the files that we did today, including the lecture, you can just get this right here. And it has the lecture, the PowerPoint for Imam Tamer, my lecture on it, and also the PowerPoint. So you just need one QR code and you'll get access to all of them. So this is it for today. And if there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. We've got a number of different questions. So Imam Tamer, if you want to get your mic as well. So how about we actually, I'll give you the microphone. And I'll use my microphone here. All right. So where are the questions? Hold on. How do I? All right, so here is a question. So I'm just going to summarize it. The question is basically asking if the person, of course, the Muslim patient, they wanted to do things probably, you know, the care provider is there and they were wondering, should they assist or should they have the family member assist with that patient? So if we're talking about they wanted to shower, should the nurse on site actually give them the shower, or would they want a family member to help them? That was a question that was directed at you, really.
Okay, yeah, that does sound, I would say that would be on a case by case, also depending on gender as well. So taking gender in consideration. I did have a patient that was a pediatrics patient, about 7 years old, and he did not want to shower because his nurse was female and she was going to give him the shower, and he refused because he was very modest at that age, being a young boy. So his father had assisted. So case by case scenario. Now, if it comes to safety, when it comes to safety and precautions, that needs to be considered as well, so that if the patient is going into the shower and they need heavy lifting and so on, then the assistance of the healthcare team should take precedence in that case.
Here's another question. How do we go about modesty when doing different, like EKG testing or probably mammogram or whatever it is? How do we deal with this? And what if it was needed?
Yeah, so EKG testing, if it's okay to reach under the garment, obviously wearing latex gloves and so on. And if we're saying in the case of there's no other gender matching to the patient, just to be considerate of placing the EKGs under a garment or under a what they call the garb of the patient or gown. And then you said the other one was mammograms.
Well, yeah, mammogram,
Yeah,
that's gonna be
the same
impossible.
thing. So like for example, you know, patients who need ultrasounds and things like that on various areas of the body, a lot of times they can be covered with like a towel. So wrapping a towel around the area and only showing the area that needs to be exposed and going over it with the device. You know, some males do need ultrasound of like the testicles, for example. So the rest of the body would be wrapped with a towel, and just the area would be exposed where they need to move the ultrasound wand.
Right, and I think it would be important to also inform the patient of which and what gender is the health provider on site is, just to let them know, that way they can feel comfortable for, you know, with asking, is there a female provider on site, and when are the days that, or the shifts that the female provider is there or available. That would help a lot. So just making them comfortable with having the choice to refuse or not refuse, and themselves evaluating the situation. Is it that urgent, or can this be something that can be delayed for the situation that she's in? So if we have an urgent case, that probably requires, you know, right now we don't have a female provider on site. And let's say this woman is right now going into labor. So it's impossible probably to get, and, you know, in the middle of the night, not most female providers are not available during the night, and it's usually male providers. So in that situation, you know, it would be important to explain it to them that all we have is a female provider. If you're able to, I guess, work it out with each other, probably exchange shift or something, that would definitely be something they would extremely appreciate. I know when I was having my baby in Methodist Hospital, I was wanting only a female provider, and they said, you can't, we don't have any. So I pressured really hard, and then they said, we managed to get a female provider from the clinic from somewhere else, just to I guess make me feel comfortable. And sometimes it is possible, and sometimes it's actually very impossible, because you just don't have somebody on site. Especially right now with COVID times, it's probably really hard to, you know, go around with different providers, but making it clear to them and making it, as I would say, modest as possible. And they would definitely appreciate if there's any way to cover. I guess this is it. If there are any questions, any other questions, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. In the previous slide, you said that technology-assisted reproduction wasn't permissible.
Mhm.
So in that case, would IVF be permissible or would it not be
So
permissible?
IVF is permissible on a condition that it is from a living husband and wife. So only from the living husband and wife only, and it cannot be from outside of those two, and they must be living. So we can't have frozen sperms, for example, and later on, the wife decided, hey, I want to get pregnant. You can't do that as long as the husband is not living anymore, even though the sperms are actually available.
So if the husband is living, but the sperm is frozen, is that okay to use that sperm? Or would you like?
It has to be from the husband and the wife only. So
Okay.
it can't be from someone else.
Okay, thank you.
So sperm banks in Islam are totally impermissible. Totally, there's no way around it. Or even egg banks. Yeah, those are impermissible. The reason to it is really because Islam regards human race and even when we're talking about the progeny and making family and all the genetics within that person is so sacred. And it involves relationships, it involves rights, it involves responsibilities. So to make sure that it is going towards a certain direction, that's why Islam is very, very strict about when speaking about whether we're talking about marriage, whether we're talking about children, making children, etc. Islam is really strict about it, and which is why it was also strict about the part about even marriage outside of sex outside of marriage. So any sexual relation outside of marriage is also extremely prohibited, really because of the issue of how sacred family is. Because family is so sacred, that's why Islam was so concerned about what it means to get yourself involved in any situation, even if that meant a DNA. I think this is it, and
Somebody had written down some questions.
yep.
Yeah, I'm curious with all of our discussions on life-saving treatments and taking those off when they're futile. I also am curious about Islamic law and customs regarding DNR orders. Are DNR orders necessary? Like, are they permissible, or is it not permissible because it essentially would end life when there's life-saving measures available?
So what was the? Oh, do not, okay. So generally speaking, if we actually have the specialists on site and they had said that the person is, whether you resuscitate or not, is basically a case that is a failing case, you do not have to resuscitate. The other thing is that if the person chose not to get resuscitated themselves, in other words, they said, I don't want any treatment, do not resuscitate, and if it happens, let it be. That's permissible as well. So if the person himself gave that permission, that's permissible. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It is 4 o'clock right now, and thank you so much for being here. It was great having you here, and thank you so much, Imam Tamer, and Barakallahu Fikum Jami'an, and Jazakumullah Khairan. There's right there, got coffee and lemonade, raspberry lemonade. I promise you, tastes so good. So we'll see you some other events. And I do actually have at the table right there, for those that didn't register, please just write your name for future events or even or even, to inform us to send you probably some of the material that will be helpful resources. And thank you so much for attending. And the people on Zoom were definitely a lot more than the people that attended here. We had just by counting, we had almost 60 people actually attending. So the Zoom was totally different than actually in person. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And barakallahu fikum. In Arabic, we say, may God bless you. And thank you so much. See the people on Zoom. Or maybe we should allow them if somebody wants to say something on mic. No one said anything. I should have said that. Allah yasalamak ya Rabbi. No one. Would anybody want to unmute themselves? Yes.